Okay, welcome to today's lesson. This was supposed to be a lesson which originally I wasn't going to do this live, but my camera doesn't seem to be working, so I have no choice but to do this lesson live. I hope that the board is all clear. I know I've done lessons on commas before. However, I wanted to clear up some thoughts, some problems, which, it gave me some problems when I looked back at my old commas video. And it's because firstly I made a mistake. I called an independent clause a subordinate clause, and I don't like that mistake. That's one I'm certainly not proud of, but everybody makes mistakes, and I hope to show you in a second that, as far as I can see, the Oxford Style Guide has made a mistake. Unless somebody can explain why it's not a mistake, I'll be interested to see that. Please put your comments under the video. Now, here are some different situations when we need commas. I'm going to go into more detail on another lesson in future about commas, because there are some other points to mention, especially in regards to what happens when the main clause, the independent clause, comes first, and the dependent clause, the subordinate clause comes second. I feel like I need to mention there's more details that need to be explained concerning commas in those kind of sentences. And also when the subordinate clause is in the middle of the main clause, I need to go into more detail there. So I'll deal with those issues in future lessons. But firstly, let's start at the beginning. So we use commas with a list of 3 or more nouns. And if you are a fan of the Oxford comma, which in schools they're not, and so don't use them if you're a school teacher, but in Oxford University Press they like the Oxford comma, and you need a comma before the and if you're a fan of the Oxford comma. If you're not a fan, or if you're in a school and you're doing an essay for your teacher, usually they don't like Oxford commas, so take away any kind of Oxford comma. Second point, a list of 2 or more gradable adjectives. The important word here is gradable. It's not to any adjectives that you need a comma with. For example, if you say French medieval poets, you will not need a comma between the French and the medieval. And that's because both of these words, French and medieval, they are classifying adjectives. They are not gradable adjectives. Now, how do you know if an adjective is gradable or if it's classifying? Well, the clue is in the name here. Gradable adjectives you can modify. Gradable adjective is like big. You can say bigger. It's like small. You can say smaller. But what you cannot say is Frencher, or even more French. We might use it like that occasionally in an informal way, but generally speaking, French is French. You can't be more French than another person. You're either French or you're not French. And the same with medieval. The noun is either medieval or it's not medieval. You can't get more medieval or less medieval, whereas you can with some adjectives. Another example would be colour. Black. You can't really get blacker. Again, informally, maybe we use it like that sometimes, but generally speaking, black is black, blue is blue, green is green. They classify, and you can't grade. You can't have different levels of blackness. Artists might disagree here, but generally speaking, that's a classifying adjective. So only if you can make it more interesting. Interesting would be a gradable adjective. Some adjectives are gradable and some adjectives are not gradable. So it all depends. And if you have a list of 2 or more gradable adjectives, then you need a comma between the adjectives. If the adjectives are not gradable, then you don't need a comma. And if it's a mixture, one gradable, one classifying, no comma also. Only use a comma if they're 2 gradable adjectives. I hope that's clear. Now, we also use commas after introductory subordinate clauses. Now, if you're unsure what a subordinate clause is, please go to my lesson on independent and subordinate clauses. But I can quickly sum it up with: a subordinate clause is not a complete thought. It's not a complete sentence. You cannot have a sentence with just a subordinate clause. every English sentence must have at least one independent clause. Compound sentences have two independent clauses, very often joined by a conjunction, a coordinating conjunction. But a subordinate clause is not a complete thought. So if the subordinate clause comes at the beginning, then you need a comma. However, sometimes you do see, quite often I think, you'll see the writer miss this comma, and in my opinion it's a mistake. If you start with a subordinate clause, you really do need the comma. But it's not just subordinate clauses, it's also phrases which are introductory, or adverbs. Now, just to give you an example of some phrases, I've got some over here. Now, immediately, Oxford make things a little bit more confusing by saying that some phrases of time and place, do not need a comma, and they even advise you not to use a comma if the phrase of time or place is short. Now, your understanding of short might be different from Oxford's understanding of short, but they explain that sentences like this, in 1991 the hospital was built, they think that it would be cluttered to use a comma. But from what I can understand, they don't mind if you include that comma. And so it is possible. In fact, they even say include it when it's ambiguous. So in this following sentence, in 2001, accidents involving juveniles were monitored. Without the comma, it could be read as in 2001 accidents. And there's the ambiguity, there's the confusion. So in those sentences, they say either rephrase the sentence or use a comma. So already you can see that commas are down to a matter of judgment in a lot of different situations. So if you've got a beginning expression of time or place, Oxford say don't use the comma if it's short, otherwise it will appear cluttered with commas. However, if there's ambiguity, certainly use the comma. So we use commas after introductory subordinate clauses, after introductory phrases, after introductory adverbs, especially when the adverb is referring to the whole sentence. The adverb is modifying here the whole of the main clause. He didn't pass the exam, it's a main independent clause. It's okay on its own. It's a full sentence on its own. And surprisingly refers to the whole of this. And so because of that, we would definitely have a comma after the adverb. We could use some other adverbs here, like however, and that would still with a comma. You notice that I've put however with a comma here. That would certainly be with a comma because it's referring to the whole of the independent clause. It's modifying the whole of that clause. Now, even an adverbial phrase which is used in an introductory way would have a comma. So, screaming loudly, he was taken to prison. The comma comes after this adverbial phrase, which actually refers to this the subject of this of the main clause. But still, it's an introductory subordinate clause. Really, it's a participle. It's a participle phrase. And it's referring to the subject of the main clause. So after adverbial phrases, also use a comma. Okay? Now, it then goes on to explain that however can be used in a second way. There's however the adverb, but there's also however the relative adverb. If we have a sentence like this, however fast Achilles runs, then however is modifying fast Achilles runs. It's modifying all of this, okay? And so it's not being used to contrast. It's not being used in that sense where we contrast. Here, however, is being used, you know, to contrast. It's saying use commas with phrases. However, don't use them with time and place phrases. So however can be used to contrast, or it can be used to say no matter how fast Achilles runs. When it's used in that situation, don't use a comma here because it's modifying what comes afterwards, and so we mustn't have a comma here. Okay? However, I would use a comma right here because this is a subordinate clause. However fast Achilles runs, it's not a whole sentence in itself. It's not an independent clause. We can't just say however fast Achilles runs, full stop. That is impossible. So I would consider this a subordinate clause, and I would have a comma here. And I have no idea why the Oxford Style Manual don't use a comma there. I've checked online, I checked Oxford website, and in all of the examples with however being used, meaning no matter how, they always have a comma after the introductory subordinate clause. So it seems to me that they're being inconsistent, and I think everybody makes mistakes with commas. I don't believe that there has been a single person on the planet who has never made a mistake with a comma. I'm sure I've made plenty. In fact, I know I've made plenty, and I'm sure everybody out there has made plenty, and I'm pretty sure that Oxford have made more than a few mistakes with commas as well. So if somebody can give me a good reason why that comma shouldn't be there, like in my book down there, the style book, please write it under the video, because I'd like to hear why. It seems to me that there needs to be a comma here. The second clause is definitely an independent clause. The first clause is definitely a subordinate clause, and I can see no reason why we wouldn't have the comma there. It seems to me it's not short, it's not something which changes the meaning. I don't think, I don't think missing the comma helps in any way. I think that it clears up ambiguity to have a comma there, so I would put one there. Okay, we also use commas in direct speech. He said, comma, I have no idea. I'm afraid, comma, Peter explained, comma, that I can't help you. In these kind of direct speech where you have these the speech marks, please use commas. However, colons are also possible. He said colon, that tends to be more formal. And short speeches need no punctuation. Peter shouted good morning, no comma at all. Again, this is where it comes down to a matter of judgment, whether you include the comma or not. But if you've got short speeches, short phrases, you don't need the comma after the shouted or said or explained. That's what my style books tells me anyway. I imagine yes and no would also not need a comma. Okay, lastly for today, but I'm going to go into more detail, perhaps later today I'll actually do more on commas, because I seem to be reading a lot about them today and it's quite interesting. Number 5, we use commas to separate non-essential information. Now this non-essential information, it could be a participle phrase, it could be an adverbial phrase, it could be an appositive, it could be a digression, it could be an aside, it could be an adverb, it could be lots of different things. It doesn't have to be just one type of thing. But I want to show you the difference of not using commas with these 4 sentences, and I hope that that will help you more than perhaps any other strategy for explaining commas, but we will look at some other situations in the next class, I promise. So my wife Helen would like to join us. This is correct punctuation in my case anyway, because I am only married to one person. Admittedly her name isn't Helen, but let's pretend that it is. And this is exactly how you would punctuate a sentence where you're talking about a person who has one wife. Because this is extra information. It's non-essential because we've already explained who, my wife. We can't get any more clearer than that. That's very clear who you're talking about. You're talking about your wife. Nobody else. You've only got one wife. So if you get rid of the commas, it suddenly becomes my wife Helen and not one of the other ones. This suddenly becomes essential information, which is telling you which wife, okay? Which wife. And so this is a really strange sentence without the commas. Well, strange in my situation anyway, because it would mean that I had more than one wife and I was trying to tell you which one. So if you have many wives, then sure, you would miss out the commas here and say my wife Helen and not one of the other wives. Okay, so that's how important the comma is. It really changes the meaning of the sentence. Now, if we look at the bottom 2 examples, I think it's more or less in the camera screen. The headmaster, breathing heavily, made the announcement. Now, this is correctly punctuated because usually in a school there is only one headmaster. However, I think it's within the realms of possibility that one school out there somewhere might have 3 different headmasters. Now, if you've got 3 different headmasters, you could miss out the commas here and say the headmaster who is breathing heavily. This suddenly becomes essential information, and it's a participle phrase. It's a reduced relative clause as well. And it's a participle phrase which is modifying headmaster. It's telling you which headmaster. So as soon as you miss out the commas, you're saying the headmaster, the one who is breathing heavily, or sorry, the one who was breathing heavily, was the one who made the announcement. So you can see how important commas are. They tell you which, if you're using commas, they're telling you that that information is just extra information. It's non-essential, and there's only one of these. But as soon as you get rid of the commas, they define which one. It means there's more than one of these, and the phrase in commas, it's telling you which one, which headmaster, the one who was breathing heavily, made the announcement. So I hope that's all clear. If anybody has any questions, you can put them very quickly up on the on my phone so I can see them, and I'll try and answer them. But if not, I'll see everybody a bit later today, perhaps, if you're around, where I'm going to go into more detail concerning subordinate clauses, not at the start of a sentence, but in the middle or at the end of a sentence, because at the end of the sentence, usually there's no comma, but not always. There are some situations when you still use a comma. Generally speaking, I can quickly tell you now that it involves contrast. If you're contrasting with the subordinate clause, you can use a comma. So that's usually with words like though or despite. You can use a comma when you're doing some kind of contrast or concession. Yeah, please ask a question if you've got one. And also the word because is a tricky one, because if it's with a negative verb, then sometimes you need a comma in order to make the meaning clear. Thirdly, you do still use a comma when the subordinate clause comes second if it's non-essential. If it's essential information, then you go without the comma. You can do without the comma. You don't need the comma. But if it's non-essential information, you can actually still use a comma even though the subordinate clause comes second. But I'll look at that in greater detail a bit later today. Okay, thanks everybody for watching, and I'd like to see you all soon.